So much of our social interactions are based on the external validation that we want from other people. The relationships that you form are a direct reflection of where you are with your relationship with yourself.
Meet Mahlodi Letsie, the founder of BearMind, a health tech marketplace that works to destigmatize mental health in African communities.
So let me give you a fun fact about how the brain works. From when we are born until we are about 7 years old, our brain is in a form of hypnosis. You just sort of pick up on behaviors based on your caretakers, based on the environment that you grow in. And all of those behaviors of your caretakers are mirrored and planted into our subconscious mind. And this is where the trick kind of comes in, where it becomes intergenerational unless you make the conscious decision to form that self-awareness to say, okay, cool, this pattern ends with me.
In this healing journey, it's not you start today and the problem is solved tomorrow. If we have to say step one and advise someone, cool, this is where you start, what is step one in your opinion? Mahlodi, how would you describe the problem that BearMind is solving?
So, quite simply, I'd say BearMind works to destigmatize mental health in African communities. We find that the stigma barrier pertaining to accessing mental health resources in Africa are so stigmatized because many communities across the continent don't speak about mental health. And this could be attributed to the fact that many African languages don't have the vocabulary to articulate mental distress. So that really piqued my interest to say, why is it that modern African people in Africa don't speak about mental health, and how can we effectively bridge that gap?
Interesting. Before we dive a bit more deeper into that problem, what's your background?
This is a contentious question. So I studied at UCT. I have my undergrad in I specialized in Bachelor of Social Science. So I triple majored in politics and governance, media and writing, and gender studies. And then I did my honors in marketing. And then I did a second postgrad qualification in mindfulness at the University of Stellenbosch's medical faculty in their Department of Psychiatry, as a way of like bridging the gap to having a bit of a hands-on approach to mental health, given that I'm not a healthcare practitioner or professional. But I know you didn't ask me this, but the reason for why I chose to go this route, specifically with our minds, we have to have a better understanding individually of how our minds work, and form a more, intimate relationship with our minds, because all things quite literally start and begin with the mind, hence the name Bare Mind.
I think that's super interesting, especially the part about, why you started. I guess my follow-up question to that would be this question about drive. I think this is really interesting to me because, the more I speak to these individuals and successful, impactful Africans on my podcast, it seems like there's this internal fuel that keeps them going. And that internal fuel comes from either childhood, comes from adversity, comes from, some sort of wound. And as a result, they are building something to either, fill that void, to prove their worth, or it's, chip on the shoulder type of fuel. What's it for you?
I'd say it's a combination of both, to be honest with you. So, what was the catalyst for me starting is in 2020, I lost my job as a result of the pandemic. So, 11 colleagues and I were retrenched, having gotten or starting our job, I think 4 months prior to that. So, it was very new. I was a new graduate, having finished my honors degree the previous year. So that really threw me for a loop. And to make matters worse, a long-term relationship came to an end during that time. So to say that I was quite devastated would be an understatement. Um, I mentioned the relationship bit is because, you know, I think when you're also young and of course like you have all these dreams and all these ambitions of who you think you're going to end up with, I think when life really has a different plan for you, it can be quite, I think yeah, it could be quite shattering, but also at the same time, it presents an opportunity to recreate yourself. And I felt that at the time, just because of how much change was happening in my life in that period of time, that I had to recreate myself into this new version of, whoever it was that I was going to become. Not fully knowing, of course, what that road or the journey ahead would look like, but I just felt this inherent drive to prove and this is where the chip on the shoulder comes in, to prove to my ex-employers that, guys, yes, you guys kicked me out 4 months after I started, but I'm actually going to start something, and I'm going to I'm going to pursue this, and I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to go back to formal employment, which I mean was wild. And I suppose the other, bit of my long-term relationship of, okay, cool, I'm gonna prove myself that, yeah, that like this relationship ending isn't gonna define me, and it's not gonna be the end of my story, because I think at that time I had really identified so much with it that I think I just needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going to be defined by the ending of my job or the ending of my relationship.
Mm. I mean, those two situations are quite traumatic, right? What
Mhm.
did you learn about yourself in that process?
Um, I'd say that when you really hit rock bottom, so during that time, okay, so the pandemic started in March. I ended up moving back home to Bloemfontein. Um, I'd say the first, I think, was it the 1st of September? So a few months later. But home at that point in time, like my family was going through a lot, understandably, because of the pandemic. My mom had just lost her job. My dad was like, retiring. So it was quite an interesting time of, financial turbulence over and above, the compounding, trauma that I was carrying from my, personal lived reality, trying to start my own life. So I'll say that it taught me resilience,
Mm.
because so much was happening, at home, with cars getting repossessed, and just a wild time. I shut myself off from a lot of my friends, because, I guess it's also like a pride thing of not wanting people to see you when you're vulnerable and going through the most, which I mean is quite also retrospectively quite sad, because, you've got good friends and you've got people around. I've got good friends and people around me for a reason. But I think I felt that the universe was really like it was like such a like tower crumbling moment, where all the things that I identified with, from my home, from my the life that I was creating, in the life that I envisioned for myself, was changing so drastically that it forced me to, during that isolation period, to really tap into my inner power reserves, if that makes sense, and to envision a new version of myself, irrespective of the fact whether my outer reality not necessarily reflecting it. But I had
Mm.
this deep like motivation, like this deep motivation to say, I'm gonna start this thing. It's been niggling away at me for a long time. And I just felt like the universe was like, okay, you said you're going to do this. You're talking a big game about how you can do this. I'm going to remove everything that you identify with. And let's see.
Before we start talking about the tools, something that just popped into my mind, which is, things happen to us that we can't control, right? Like, losing a job, breaking up with your partner at the time, and then, of course, COVID hitting, like, all of those things are out of our control. But we can, play the victim and blame the environment and the external situation for the situation that we are in, or we can
Mhm.
actually, do something about it. For you, and this is something that I also think about, what do you think is that kind of, I think the word you used was a catalyst moment for people to either do something about it or kind of sit in that victim mindset and mentality?
I feel that I've lived several lives in like one life, and it's weird to say because I only just turned 29, but I think, in my formative years, I was very rebellious. I've always wanted to do things on my own terms and like dance to the beat of my own drum. And of course, you're going to get burnt if you, of course, do that. So I started going out quite young, drinking, experimenting with partying and all like kind of toxic behaviors that weren't necessarily good for me. But that led me to fail a grade, right, in grade 9. And that was quite I'd say, pivotal point in my life for me where I had another trajectory shift where it was like, okay, cool. You say you want to get into UCT. How are you going to get into UCT with the grades that you do? Like you failed a grade. So for me, that was a time for me to introspect and to course correct in that. Um, where it was an early lesson for me to see the power of my mind, because by the end of my high school career, I finished with, distinctions and I got into UCT. Um, but I'd say that in as much as I got that lesson at a young age, there was still more, traumas that I had to kind of unlearn, of not being good enough, not feeling like I'm worthy of certain things, and not feeling like I am, yeah, that I'm not good enough to experience whatever good things that I had, that I wanted for my life. So I'd say then my university experience, where again, falling back into those practices of going out as a coping mechanism, drinking, blah, 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 um, I learned that those weren't helping me at all, right? Like I knew it. So during that time in my varsity career, I then discovered mindfulness and I started listening to podcasts like Super Soul Sundays. And I remember some of the guests that Oprah would speak about purpose, right? And like discovering your purpose and what that means. And I mean, I'd never thought about what my purpose is. I never knew what I wanted to do, irrespective of the fact that, sure, I got into this university, but then what? What career did I want to pursue? I didn't know any of those things. So, having had the opportunity to listen to those podcasts and to now start planting the subconscious seeds of what my life could pan out into was really powerful for me. Because now, to answer your question, by the time, ish hit the proverbial fan, I think I knew enough not to default into the toxic behaviors that I would have when I was younger. And at that point in time, like the feelings of, not being good enough, depression, losing, significant things in my life were so strong that I felt that I could either sink into the depression that I was in at that point in time, or I could use that as a fuel to change the script. And I can't answer that question for you. I don't know how to articulate what that switch is, but I guess
Mm,
it's wanting more for yourself and not succumbing to that, irrespective of how deep, like deep the feelings of depression and the feelings of worthlessness and just all of those combined may be. There's still there was still that like inkling and that nudge to say, okay, cool, like there's so much more for you out there,
Mm.
just take a leap.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting point that you made. Like like you can't really explain it, but you just knew that, okay, cool, you're not gonna, perhaps dive into unhealthy coping mechanisms when you're experiencing this pain. And I think another way I like to think of it is there's pleasure and there's pain.
Mhm,
And a lot of people are, driven by pleasure, i.e., seek things that make them feel good. But a lot of people are also driven by pain, not to
mhm,
experience pain, but to get away from pain. And I
mhm,
think that for me, I'm definitely driven to get away from pain.
mhm,
And so and I'll give an example, like for me, when I started my first business, it was
mhm,
also super turbulent time from a financial point of view. And, I was studying, it was back in 2018. I was trying to finish my degree while still trying to like support myself because my family was going through some financial struggle.
mhm,
And it had to be like a really painful moment that drove me into taking action and starting my first business.
mhm,
I wouldn't have started if there wasn't that, big pain that I was trying to get away from, i.e., that I call it toxic fuel, that
mhm,
thing that drives you. I really feel that if if the situation is super painful in which you can't take it anymore, i.e., that rock bottom moment, I think that essentially catapults us into action and into something that's essentially getting us out of that. And of course, like it also seems that you had the self-awareness to realize that you know diving into unhealthy coping mechanisms is not the answer.
mhm.
How did you develop that awareness and to actually realize I need to develop my personal wellness practice?
So I think what helped me develop that was really the fact that when I got to university, um, there was just so much imposter syndrome that I felt, of like, again, not being good enough. Okay, cool, I got into this university, but like, like there are so many more amazing people that are, here as well.
Mm.
So grappling with that anxiety, grappling with, my own self-image, my inner dialogue was very negative. I was very hard on myself, like my inner critic was very, very, very hard on myself. And as a result, like I just found that I would get into toxic situations, like because of the choices that I was making. So going out as a coping mechanism, the people that I would choose to, be with at that point in time, like relationships, um, those were all coming from, my toxic, negative dialogue. And of course, when you're in that place of negativity, you can't attract good things, right? Because you of course, the saying, you don't attract what you want, you attract what you are. And
Mm.
I feel the attributes, or the attributes I was embodying at that point in time weren't constructive to me. So I remember in 2016, after, like an event where, it was quite traumatic, but I remember going home and saying, I'm actually never going to put myself in a situation like this, like making a bargain with myself to say, I want to learn how to take better care of myself. I don't know what that looks like because I came from a very, conventional Christian home. I'd never been exposed to mindfulness, meditation, self-regulation, none of that. My connection to spirituality came from a religious lens, which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think for the fact that I've always had like this fascination with my mind and almost the esoteric, metaphysical kind of practices, even though I couldn't articulate them, but I knew that they existed. I just opened myself up to the universe to say, look, I'm going into my third year of university. I want to finish my degree strong. I don't want to fall into the same practices and habits. And from there, I'd say that really that intention that I put out into the universe um, was heard, because that was the year that the following year, when I started my third year, that was the year that I met, the ex-partner. But I think he was so pivotal in just like teaching me about metaphysical practices and mindfulness and meditation and all of the things that I knew existed out there, but I could never articulate. We would have all sorts of conversations like that, and that really expanded my consciousness.
Mm. And I want to talk more about the problem, right? So you mentioned that, you were asking yourself these questions like, why aren't there more people of color that are speaking about these problems and issues? And we know the problems exist because, I mean, life is intense and we have a lot of responsibilities. I
Yeah.
mean, you know this from running a business, right? As an entrepreneur, when you first were starting off, like, we wear many hats. And then apart from the business side of things, there's of course the personal life and you have responsibilities. Now imagine on top of that, if you had a family or have a family with kids, and there's all these responsibilities that can be overwhelming. So we know that life is overwhelming, right? But on the other side of it, it's how we handle those situations and how we are able to manage ourselves to essentially cope with what's going on, and not just cope but thrive.
Yes.
But those individuals that, are just getting overwhelmed, is the problem that they don't know how to essentially manage themselves? Or is it, perhaps, what is it from that individual that's, feeling overwhelmed, have all these responsibilities, but not doing anything about it?
Hmm. So let me give you a fun fact about how the brain works, right? So from when we are born, right, until we are about 7 years old, our brain is basically in a form of hypnosis, right? So, for example, when you're born, you're not given I always say this, but you're not given a fat textbook to say, study your family lineage. You just sort of like pick up on behaviors based on your caretakers, based on the environment that you grow in. And all of those behaviors of your caretakers are mirrored and planted into our subconscious mind, right? So that by the time we turn 7 years old and our personal identities start to come to the fore, all of those behaviors are embedded in the subconscious mind. So now, to answer your question about where that comes from, whether it is people not knowing how to manage themselves, or the other bit is the fact that if you look at African history, right, from a broader perspective, where for the most part, nuclear homes are not a thing. For the most part, people are being raised in single parented homes. There's a lot of intergenerational trauma, whether it be, alcohol abuse, gender-based violence, financial lack, all of those things, right? And those, again, based on the homes that we grow up in, of course, our caretakers try their very best based on what was modeled for them. And this is where the trick kind of comes in, where it becomes intergenerational unless you make the conscious decision to form that self-awareness to say, okay, cool, this pattern ends with me. But for the most part, people are operating from those subconscious behaviors that they themselves are not aware of, right? And I think Joe Dispenza says by the time we're 35 years old, the brain is quite literally like it's like a supercomputer, right? And based on the programs that you download, the applications that you download, is how optimally your brain will function at the end of the day. So if you're downloading faulty applications into your supercomputer, of course, that supercomputer is not going to be primed to perform at its optimum, right?
Mm.
Versus when you then become conscious of the programs that you're actively downloading into your supercomputer, that's when you can then tap into neuroplasticity and all these amazing sciences and practices that can help us, redirect the trajectory of our lives.
Mm.
But again, self-awareness is the key. So in many African communities, we aren't fortunate to be exposed to having this access to this information, which I
Mm.
think is why it's so important for us to be able to learn fundamentally the science of how the mind works, so that with that knowledge you can then be empowered to make better decisions. But you can't make better decisions if you don't know that you have a problem to start off with.
100%. And just I just want to pause quickly because you mentioned so many valuable points and insights there. So firstly, you mentioned 0 to 7, those formative years are super important because essentially our brain is a sponge,
Mm.
and we're absorbing and essentially forming our identity even from that early age. As time goes on, especially growing up in impoverished communities and rural communities, even if you go to other African countries or even South Africa, right? We become a product of our environment, and so we do what was done to us.
Yes.
Cool. Now, you mentioned self-awareness perhaps being the answer to maybe the first step, but I guess I just want to zone in on this. What is the effect of not dealing with this?
I mean, quite literally self-destruction, right? If you're exposed to trauma, that trauma hurt people at the end of the
Mm.
day. And if you don't deal with the demons that, the demons, or the traumas that lie within you, they will come out one way or another, whether it's to your loved ones, whether it's to yourself. I mentioned earlier about my own self, my negative self-talk, and no home is perfect, right? I say this because my parents are married. I had both of my parents. My dad has an engineering background. My mom is an academic. She has a PhD in nursing. So even with two people who are trying their best, ultimately, based on how they were raised and what they know is some of the hurts and the traumas that they'll pass on to their kids without even knowing it, without even intentionally trying to harm. And I say this is why it's so important for parents, for individuals, for kids, for everyone really to have the tools to develop
Mm.
awareness as early as possible, so that they can articulate and learn, okay, cool, this is how I'm feeling. It's not a result of, or my mom just lashed out at me, she's frustrated, she's having a day. It's not because I'm not good enough.
Mm.
There are so many ways to reframe how we move in the world once we have the tools to articulate and have the tools to be able to decipher from an observation perspective, um, than it is to kind of take everything on, and say, okay, cool, this is my fault. And that's how you get into that victim mentality, you know.
100%. And
Yeah.
still sticking on this problem because I really want to emphasize how big of a problem this is, right?
Mhm.
Um, how much of work have you been doing, or have you been exposed to perhaps clients and users on your platform where trauma has been playing out in their adult life, right? So they could have gone through a traumatic experience, at an early age, and that perhaps is playing out in their life. And I'll give an example. Perhaps they were exposed to a a parent leaving,
Mhm.
so that essentially triggers an abandonment wound.
Mm.
And so now they get into a relationship and there's a deep trust issue because they always think that their partner's going to leave because
Mm.
that's what they saw growing up, right?
Mm.
Now, this, of course, is like one way that that traumatic experience can play out in your life and how it affects you. But even going a bit deeper, trauma manifesting into disease. Have you seen, any of your clients or users on the platform or people that you were exposed to that, went through that traumatic experience, didn't deal with it, and then it manifested into disease?
That's such an important question. So, without, of course, revealing the identities of clients, but yes, 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 yes. I think what we don't realize is that our words, the dialogue that we speak in ourselves, in our, in our inner selves, our inner dialogue, really has the power to make or break our lives, quite literally, which is why practices like affirmations, um, journaling, quite literally scripting, your life, those practices are so important, because the words that we speak over our lives are prophecies that can manifest in different ways in our lives. There is a correlation in how the emotion of anger and unresolved, anger, deep emotion like that, can result in cancer diagnosis. The reason for that, I mean, there's a book, The Body Keeps the Score, where our
Mm-hmm.
bodies absorb our emotions, and if we don't have the outlet to express or release those emotions, they quite literally stay in the body and cause, all sorts of harmful things.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. And, I heard you speak about this before of the effects on the nervous system that perhaps, the stress that we don't deal with, or the external environment, the things that are, out of our control, and that, happen to us and we don't process that, it really affects our nervous system and our ability to, manage ourselves and function in everyday life. Talk to us more about the effects on our nervous system.
So, with the parasympathetic nervous system, that is the body's natural ability to heal, regenerate itself. And it's found that when you're in that state, which can be triggered through deep belly breathing and like breath work, and just regulating your nervous system to diffuse the hormones of stress, cortisol in the body, that sends a signal to the body to say, okay, cool, it's safe. I don't have to be in fight or flight mode. I don't have to, there isn't an imminent threat. So when the body or the nervous system, and what is fascinating is that your body going into the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight response, can quite literally be triggered by your mind. Before, it was a survival instinct when, of course, we were living in the wild, and there's this threat of an animal coming to attack us. Your body would get into fight or flight mode as a self-protective mechanism, right? But now, because we're triggered by all sorts of stimuli on a daily basis, texts from our phones, a boss triggering us at work, kids, our partners, there are many factors that can make us uh, activate that fight or flight response. And when you operate in that nervous system for too long, it drains the body's natural capacity to regenerate, because now energy is not focused on sending signals to say, okay, it's safe, let the body regenerate, let it focus on strengthening the immune system. Now it's going towards being in a literal bracing for impact kind of mode, where you're looking out for danger, and the danger could literally be in your mind. It may not be a physical imminent danger, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
this is why, again, self-regulatory practices like mindfulness and meditation, which basically train the mind to go inwardly and to remove the external focus on our everyday activities, and the things that trigger us. It gives us the
Mhm.
opportunity to look inwardly, to become familiar with, um, and the more we can do that, the better we can get at um, learning how to self-regulate and self-soothe, so that when those imminent triggers arise, we know how to diffuse them adequately, and we don't have to live in extended periods in the sympathetic nervous system.
100%. Thank you for that explanation. It was really insightful. And you've touched on so many tools already. So let's speak about the tools. And I guess in this healing journey, it's not you start today and the problem is solved tomorrow. I
Oh,
mean, what I've noticed is it's a journey, and it could even be a lifelong journey, because I mean, in this human experience, we are going to continue to be exposed to all sorts of different things, new experiences, new environments, business expanding. We're going to continue to grow. So, in my mind, I don't think that the healing and the internal work is 1 month and then you're done. I think that it's continuous, right?
100%.
And if we have to say step one and advise someone, cool, this is where you start. What is step one in your opinion?
Um, if I were to put myself back in the early days of my healing journey, I think step one is to identify not feeling good in your body. So that sinking feeling where like you're just constantly feeling anxious, nothing externally makes you feel better. You could I remember, I would always avoid being by myself. I had this fear of being by myself, so I'd suppress that fear by constantly being around people, going out, suppressing that sinking feeling that I'm not okay, but suppressing it because I was so scared of what I would what would be revealed to me if I sat by myself and if I actually investigated that feeling long enough. So I'd say we live in a society where we're constantly we're overstimulated. We are numb to ourselves because of the stimuli around us. When we feel lonely, we've got our phones, we've got social media. We avoid our problems by going out and partying and drinking. I think, especially in South African culture, where drinking it's a lifestyle, and like it's just how we socialize and how we interact with people. So I think really being intentional to have or to learn that discernment of whether you're being around people to fill the time or whether it's actually meaningful engagements that you're actually going out to
Mm,
spend with people. And in that, I will say cultivating the importance of spending that time by yourself, because
mm,
we're so conditioned to give outwardly. We're constantly pouring of ourselves and our energy into our work, into
mm,
our family, our friends, that there's often very little left for ourselves, at the end of the day. And you can't pour from an empty cup, right? So really being intentional to say, I love what I do. You may or may not, but I love what I do. I love the people around me. But I think for me to show up as my best self, I need to be intentional to spend time with myself.
yeah, I think that's a really good tip. Being by yourself and essentially cultivating that, or recharging. I guess that's the way I would describe it.
Yes. Yes.
Recharging. But I guess the question would be, not many people are comfortable with themselves, with their own thoughts. Some people don't enjoy their own company. How are you helping these people, and what are you saying to them?
I remember I hated being by myself. I hated, the thought again, the thought was so scary. But I promise you, the more you challenge yourself to spend small increments of time by yourself, whether that is, saying, I'm going to take myself out on a coffee date and just be by myself, no friends, just be in a restaurant by yourself and getting comfortable being yourself. By yourself, I promise you, it won't feel comfortable immediately, but the more you do it, the more you get comfortable being by yourself and enjoying your own company without needing that external validation. I promise you, is where everything turns around, because so much of our social interactions are based on the external validation that we want from other people. But if you
Mm,
learn to, really tap into your own self as a source of validation, you'll find that like you'll become more comfortable being by yourself. And like, if and really being able to interrogate the kind of relationships that you have around you, because once you get comfortable being by yourself, you realize that, you know, the relationships that you form are a direct reflection of where you are with your relationship with yourself, because other people are really just mirrors, to you. So I mentioned earlier that the relationships that I'd get in when I was unaware of my negative inner critic really were reflections of how much I loved myself.
Yeah, there's something that, you mentioned, which is so insightful, which is we tend to seek validation from outside as opposed to, inside out.
Mhm.
Validation comes from, what I learned was, as you mentioned there, is we can only love others as much as we love ourselves. We can only attract the amount of people, opportunities, as we can only meet people as far as we meet ourselves. And I think
Yeah.
that if more people can just like realize this, and get to this point, I think we will have more joyful people and a society.
But you see, this is why representation is so important, because for a long time, the picture of wellness has never necessarily been inclusive of brown people, right? And as a result, there's almost been this otherness of wellness not being for us, And if you don't have people, and I'm not saying that we must put people on pedestals, but if you don't have people that are actively modeling healthy behaviors and healthy habits, if you don't come from a situation where that is modeled in your immediate environment, it doesn't exist in your frame of mind. It doesn't exist as a reality. So this is why it's so important to reframe what wellness looks like and reimagine what wellness looks like for modern Africans in modern Africa. And I guess this is why we exist, because I think, to your point, if more people can see what wellness looks like and how simple it can be, and it being modeled by people who look like people of color and who look like them, it then gets reinforced into their subconscious mind to say, if this person who looks like me, who comes from a similar situation and background, can attain this kind of lifestyle or attain wellness, not having had the perfect background or not having had, circumstances that were completely ideal, that is extremely validating in ways that I don't think understand, and I think this is why, yeah, representation is everything.
So one of the reasons why I started this was to showcase people of different backgrounds, coming from different environments, the rags to riches stories, because we need to see people that look like us that we can aspire to be. And that's such a valid point that you also mentioned there. And bear in mind, you guys help with a variety of different tools, and I want to speak about a few of those tools. Let's speak about meditation. There's
Mhm.
so much, like, stigma aside, it's benefited me dramatically, like, sorry, drastically throughout my journey. From when I first started off, back in 2020, that's when I like really started my self-development journey.
Mhm.
And at first, of course, it was really tough to meditate, because I mean, your mind is busy, you can't sit for long periods of time. And the more you do it, the better you get at essentially, firstly, sitting, and then secondly, quietening down your mind. How have you been helping people to firstly start? And second part of the question is, what have been the benefits that you've noticed?
So I think with how I've benefited people to start, we are in the process of finalizing a 6-week mindfulness course, having had using myself as a guinea pig to say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to study mindfulness for 2 years. Let me see how it impacts me so that we can then turn the insights and the learnings that we got from the course into a digital product that people can access. And, you know, Africa Tech was my first opportunity to lead a public kind of, well, not public. I had, taught people while I was, training, but really leading a diverse group of people that don't have any connection to each other, group of strangers coming into a room. And the reception that I got was so heartening to say that, guys came up to me to say, this really reshaped the way that I thought about meditation. People were saying that it was so helpful just to bring into their realm of awareness that mindfulness and meditation doesn't mean that you have to be a guru meditating in the Himalayas levitating, right? Like you can quite literally access it at all points during your day. And I think by to really re-echo the point that I was making of having access to representation, seeing more practitioners that are more inclusive and representative of the different cultures and the different ethnicities that exist in this melting pot of, the South African broader South African culture is so important, because I think that in and of itself is validating to say, if this person who is young or this person who is, an entrepreneur still figuring it out can meditate, it is accessible, as opposed to it being the homogeneous person who has an asymmetric haircut and like, linen meditating only. Do you get what I mean? Like, I think
Yeah.
opening it up is the key to really empowering and impacting more communities. And with that said, that is what we want to do with our platform. Once we've really concluded these pilots that we're looking to run with corporate clients, and once we've really have a better understanding of what the data is telling us, availing more content and courses specifically that are that have an element of gamification to incentivize and reward people based on their activity and based on them participating in their mental wellness journey, will be the catalyst, I believe, to impacting more communities to say, here are the resources. They're made in Africa by Africans, different practitioners, different, teachers, wellness teachers, because wellness is not a one size fits all solution, but having different teachers who have different styles and access to different materials and courses on a platform that has an element of gamification to empower and reward the next person to prioritize their mental wellness journey is really the kind of impact that we're looking to make at scale.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think the work that you guys are doing is incredible, and I just hope that more people are able to, get in touch with, and I hope that your marketing team is on point to reach as many people as possible. Because I mean, it's such a valuable product. So thank you for sharing that. Mahlodi, the last part of the podcast is called the fast fire. So I'm going to ask you these quick questions, and if you could answer in one word or a short sentence, that would be super, super cool.
Okay, cool.
If you could enforce one universal habit for mental health, what would it be?
That anything is possible. That recreation of the mind is absolutely possible.
I like that. What's the most critical change you'd like to see in South Africa in terms of the mental health landscape?
Government needs to do more. It's unacceptable that the mental health policy from a legislation perspective was last updated in 2002. We need to do more. It needs to be more universal. It needs to be more accessible. We need to do more. They need to do more,
22 years ago.
literally.
Goodness. What's one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self, let's say 10 years ago?
Hmm. That I have the power to achieve anything that I put my mind to.
And what's one piece of advice you'd say to your future self?
Jeez. Yo, I'm so proud of you. Like
Mm.
you, yeah, I'm so proud of you and I can't wait to meet you.
Yo, goosebumps. Next steps, what can you share with us? Of course, he spoke to us about, the platform and, how that's going to be improved and rolled out. But what's something that you can share with us in the coming months, Q1, Q2, 2025?
So Q1, we've just piloted this past weekend. My brother-in-law he turned 40 in October, but he celebrated his 40th this past weekend. And we saw it as an opportunity to pilot a mental wellness card game that we're looking to roll out in the first quarter, called Bear It All. It's a deck of cards, questions regarding your mental health that you can play with your family and friends. And I'm really excited to see how that product is going to perform in the market. I think from a B2C perspective, that will really be a great way for us to segue into podcast, short form content, seeing how other people in our community engage with it and what mental health means to them. So it's a broader way for us to have an extended conversation with members in our community on what mental health means to them. So that's exciting. And really, another exciting thing that we're looking forward to is just growing Bare Mind. So more awareness of, or rather more visibility of us on social media platforms. We really want to create more informative content, partnering with brands, and really amplifying the conversation around mental health, partnering again with corporates as a way to do so, to create events, retreats. So there's a lot in store for us that we're really working on behind the scenes. We've been sending out a lot of proposals to different organizations that I'm really excited to see the fruits of these seeds that we're planting with these organizations really turn into fruition in 2025 and beyond.
Amazing. Thank you, Mahlodi. Thank you for sharing all these insights with us. And I really enjoyed our conversation. And I really hope that people will just watch this twice because there's so many. Sorry. Yeah, because there were so many valuable points in this. So thank you for sharing your journey with us, and thank you for the impact that you're making. I feel like it's so important, the work that you're doing with Bare Mind, and I just hope that the platform grows as big as possible, and you really impact millions. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope when we have this conversation next time, it will be in person so that we can, yeah, just have a conversation in person. But thank you so much for everyone who listened and for following us on our journey, and really for the platform to have this very important conversation.